How's everybody today? Very happy to be here with you all. And we're going to have today a brief update on previous broadcasts, lectures that I've given on ISIS, the Islamic State, which seems now to have faded from view, but only as far as Western perceptions are concerned. Very much not the case in terms of terrorist, jihadist, rebel groups in different parts of the world, including in many parts of Africa, for instance, claiming affiliation to ISIS. Now, whether or not there's a formal affiliation, a tangential affiliation, or simply some kind of claiming of affiliation for the sake of giving a curious kind of dignity to the rebel group, some kind of validation. All of these questions remain unanswered. But all the same, it means that ISIS continues, at least as a point of reference for certain kinds of rebellion. And although this kind of rebellion has always been characterized as archaic, antiquarian, to the point of being medieval in its outlook, in fact, its teachings are much more recent than many people would suspect. The same kinds of teaching that underscore the deep fabric of conservatism in Saudi society, for instance. And while Saudi Arabia plays a modern game in terms of its international relations, it's very clear. Henry Kissinger, the former US Secretary of State, picked up on this, that it probably plays a double game, a subterranean game as well as the diplomatic public game, a subterranean game of financing terrorism underneath jihadist or Wahhabist colors. The teacher Wahhabi, having come out of the deserts with the founders of the House of Saud, with a very purist form of Islam, informed by the Spartan conditions of the desert in which he lived. This, of course, stands in quite gross contradiction to the opulence in which the House of Saud today lives. But all the same, the strictures, the idea that there could be at least a spiritual, if not a material purity, continue to haunt not only the undercurrent of political as well as social life in Saudi Arabia, but also there's a vision that is very, very attractive in countries where there is gross corruption. In other words, the return to a purity is a return to something before the era of corruption, which is often conflated with the era of Western materialism and the quest for Western riches. So all of these things remain a dynamic, but it's actually incorrect to view ISIS as it came onto the scene as something that was entirely medieval, antiquarian, simply Wahhabist. There are actually two major characteristics that I want to reiterate in today's presentation. The first is a very, very simple one. Basically, it was a rebellion against the international state structure. This is often not appreciated. It was different from the rebellion of Iran underneath the Ayatollahs after the revolution in Iran in 1979. Because although the not fully successful effort to install an Islamic constitution in that country, with all kinds of exceptional clauses so the country could function along lines, what you also had was an effort to continue with international relations as a state among other states. When war broke out against Iran, the invasion led by Iraq, Saddam Hussein's Iraq at the behest of both the Americans and the Saudis, Iran being the headquarters, as it were, of international Shia Islam, whereas Saudi Arabia was the headquarters of international Sunni Islam. Billions of dollars were channeled into this invasion by both the US and Saudi Arabia. The Iranians fought using modern weapons, and the Iranians appealed for diplomatic support, some of which was forthcoming. And in fact, in the military standoff, in which neither side won, but both sides suffered, this stalemate between the two sides, which in the end came out in Iran's political advantage, basically it was achieved by modern military means. I had a PhD student from Iran, from the Iranian Air Force, who came to me subsequently, describing to me in great detail the modernity of the struggle from the Iranian side. So modernity of warfare is one thing that I want to characterize here, but Iran nevertheless wanted to stay within the international community of states. And that international community of states basically began in 1648 in Europe with the Treaty of Westphalia. Actually, there were a number of treaties, but we conflate them all into a single expression. The Treaty of Westphalia, in which the warring nations of Europe, of which there were well over 100, assembled at Westphalia not only to end war and to prevent the recurrence of the sort of war that had ravaged Europe for decades, the 30 Years' War, for instance, which had ravaged Europe along confessional or religious lines, Protestant, Catholic. And even those countries not directly affected by the war, countries like France, for instance, basically militarized their societies just in case the violence spilled over the borders into France. So when you read Alexander Dumas' Three Musketeers, for instance, and it's a saga of competing militias. The Musketeers are one militia among others. Cardinal Richelieu's militia is another. And this was the militarization of France, the readiness for war should it spill over. Well, Westphalia did two things. First of all, it reduced the number of states in Europe. Tiny states that we still see today, like Liechtenstein, like San Marino, like Andorra, these are the residue of what was a commonality throughout Europe at that point in time. So many states that a lot of the early discussions of Westphalia were about the protocols of who seats where. Is there a conference table big enough for all of you guys? But basically, the amalgamation of states into coherent but larger units derived from Westphalia. The shape of Europe today derives from Westphalia. And the whole tendency towards some kind of unity or formal systems of cooperation. And we see that very, very much as a feature of today's Europe. Only Great Britain wishes to stand outside those formal frameworks, which basically genuflect towards a desirable final overall unity. All of that began at Westphalia. In other words, if you're united, you won't fight against others because all of those others are now part of you. But the other more, as it were, revolutionary outcome of Westphalia was because there had been 30 years of religious war. The agreement was the state system, the international state system, should be secular. Iran became, in 1979, a theocratic state, at least in terms of a self-advertisement, but it still sought to be part and to behave according to the rules of a secular state system. In terms of its clandestine support of terrorist groups, far greater by Saudi Arabia than by Iran, it's Saudi Arabia that has behaved very, very much in secret, but transparent secrets. It's behaved as a non-Westphalian state. But in formal terms and in pretty much commonly held terms, observed terms, and operational terms, it's a secular state system. The United Nations, for instance, is a secular organization. The European Union is a secular organization. So what you had with ISIS when it broke out onto the scenes, the key, as it were, message that it put forward was it wished to be exempt from the secular state system. It wanted to establish itself as a religious state, a pure religious state. It wished to advertise the idea of its kind of religious state, the caliphate, as being the desirable model for the entire state system. Obviously, a conversion to Islam was very, very much part of the agenda, but very, very much also a view of the state system, not as something apostate because secular, but something able to be blessed by God because religious, because Islamic, because in a pure sense, Islamic. So the first point I want to make is that this rebellion is a rebellion against the state system. In this, it was profound and it was a revolutionary ambition. The second point I want to make, and I want to go into this in its different parts, is that the operationalization of this vision of a changed state system, the operationalization of the quest, of the militarized but also digitalized quest for this new religious Islamic, purist Islamic state system was extraordinarily modern. Basically, for a long time after the military defeat, finally, of ISIS, and I'll go into that in a short moment or two, what you had was the continuation of the organization as a digital state. Now, in fact, the two states, geopolitical and digital, had operated side by side since the inception of the conquests of ISIS. And from the outset, the digital state was extremely sophisticated and extremely well set up and extremely effective in its penetration of electronic media around the world. The way this was done was absolutely modern, state-of-the-art technologies, state-of-the-art use of media, the psychology of media, particularly social media, the use of different websites, the cascade of links, and finally portals that led you to the dark web, and then finally one-on-one recruitment programs conducted with a methodology of conversion and commitment, not unlike what happens when someone converts to Catholicism in your discussions with the priest, or conversion to Judaism in your discussions with the rabbi before the final steps of conversion are taken. Basically, that kind of methodology, which is basically a facilitator, it's gentle, it has a message, it's persuasive, it seeks commitment, of course, it's evangelical. But what you have there at the apex of a very, very sophisticated digital bringing into the fold of those who wished to convert was a psychological demeanor which infected the entire process, in fact, of online media and online theology. In other words, what I want to say is that the immediate sense from most commentators of the social media and the other media, a very great number of short films and broadcasts made by ISIS studios, using latest studio techniques, I hasten to add. Basically, what you had in all of this kind of media onslaught was not what many people call simplified theology. It is if you take it fragment by fragment. Oh, in this short little Facebook, this short little online piece of messaging, Everything is simplified to the point of being banal. If you join them all up, and there's a pattern to how these can be joined up, you get a theology which may not exactly be like the theology that you would encounter in a seminary, an Islamic seminary, in a madrasa of a high-powered sort, but it's profound all the same in terms of its worldview, what's wrong with it, what can be done about it, and in terms of the reasoning from scripture and from the words of wise Islamic thinkers as to A, what is wrong with the world, B, what can be done about this wrongness in the world, and finally, very much finally, C, what the individual viewer, listener, can do to take part in this conversion of the world. And if the world is resistant, then can it be made to convert, change, become more pure, become more just in a militarized fashion? So that kind of sophistication, using revered thinkers in the Islamic canon, sometimes ignoring the fact that they were quite pragmatic themselves back in that day, but all the same, taking what was in the past forward into the future. In other words, the intellectual genealogies being used in the messaging requires, for an understanding of what's going on, a familiarity with exactly the genealogies of thought in the traditions and the schools of Islam. In other words, looking at the messaging at face value superficially is not going to tell you what's going on. In terms of the militarization of it all, I want to make the point that this was extremely modern. Look, they cut through an Iraqi army expensively trained and equipped by the Americans like a knife through butter. Cut through the Syrian forces at first, although they were very much rent by civil war, ISIS growing out of one of the factions, the al-Nusra Front, in this civil war, supplanting the al-Qaeda affiliations of the al-Nusra Front, which was divided then between affiliation to al-Qaeda and the newcomer, the new kid on the block, ISIS, that promised something more than what al-Qaeda promised. Promised the materialization of the caliphate, the just center of the new world order, the just replacement of Westphalia. And from a weakened Syria, they swept into what should have been a militarily well-established Iraq. As I said, American trained and equipped. And as I said, like a knife through butter. And the tactics they used were twofold. The first was that they used mobility, in other words, motor vehicle mobility of an incredibly fast sort. You had very much the use of Toyota Hilux pickups. American soldiers have often complained that they would like to have such vehicles. They're just faster than anything anyone else has got. Very much pioneered in 1980 by Colonel Gaddafi on the plains of Chad in the civil war of that period. Used very much in the assault of the Taliban against Kabul when they first won power. Used again in the fight against Gaddafi, which finally led to his downfall. Something ironic there, since he had pioneered the use of these vehicles in the first place. But the use of these vehicles in a huge number of squadrons, or hundreds of them, bespoke in an identical fashion. Someone did a job lot in getting these Toyotas. No one's been able to trace, or at least they say they haven't been able to trace, how they got to Syria and Iraq. Just like no one can say how they got to Afghanistan. All with mounted recoilless rifles or Browning machine guns, able to stay in place by identical drilling down to the chassis of all of these vehicles. Okay, that's one thing. You've actually got the hardware then. But the point I wanted to make now was very, very much, yes, but then they were deployed according to an operational strategy which came directly from Clausewitz. Clausewitz was a Prussian general who, time and again, found himself on the receiving end of Napoleon's conquests. Why can't I stand against what Napoleon is doing? His analysis as to why he failed, why he was defeated, why his own superior officers were no better than anything he could think of, was because of what he diagnosed as Napoleon's basic strategy, which he recorded in his great book on war. To this day, in almost every single military academy on earth, you're going to be an officer, the first textbook they give you to read is Clausewitz's on war. When I talked to the generals of guerrilla armies in places like Eritrea, as the 1990s began, for instance, and they outlined to me how they defeated Soviet-equipped and Soviet-officered armies, and I said, how did you do it? And their reply was a one sentence. I read Clausewitz. Basically, in its essence, is concentrate all your forces as swiftly as you can and attack the enemy's weakest point before he can mobilize to defend that weakest point. But to be able to be faster than your enemy, to be able to attack his weakest point faster than he can defend it, bring reinforcements to defend it, you need to have the kind of speed and concentration of speed to make that kind of breakthrough. Thus the Toyota Hiluxes. Thus Guderian, in his smashing through French defenses of a static nature in World War II with his Panzer divisions. Thus the Israelis, and their defeat was catastrophic for the Egyptians of the Egyptian army in the first major Arab-Israeli war. Thus, what ISIS did in Iraq, conventional formations could not stand before them. Concentration of speed, force through the weakest point of the enemy, stretched out along a broad front, anticipating a conventional attack. It comes like cavalry, like Napoleon's cavalry. The man on horseback, the men on horseback, the men in Toyota Hiluxes. And the other point that's ancillary to this, but key, is that, look, the officers, the generals, the field officers, the equivalent of colonels of the ISIS forces, were simply better generals, better colonels than anything that the Iraqis had, despite American training. Now, how do you divorce these two, modernity and antiquity? It's a curious contradiction. It's, however, something which leads to a curious contemplation of the future. If they had won Iraq at least, would a caliphate centered in Iraq and maybe part of Syria have been able to survive without seeking interstate recognition of some sort? Would they have been in some way domesticated into the international state system? In other words, it all begs the question of what would have happened if there had been a moment in which they were faced with the question of pragmatism. Well, we'll never know that. But it continues to survive in a kind of digital form, in a kind of, as I said at the beginning, affiliating form. It continues to survive above all, not so much in a digital caliphate. When it was geopolitically defeated, it lost its studios. So its broadcasts are not anywhere near as sophisticated as they used to be. But the idea of a coherent theology that all the same can be presented in modern terms, and by that I very much stress the modernity of digital communication, digital media, social media. That speaks to modern times in a way that's far more profound, far more organized, far more coherent than Donald Trump's tweets, for instance. So it leaves us with a conundrum as to how to regard something which is not yet a finished product, and this project is not yet a finished product. What could have been is a big question, particularly what kind of pragmatism would have been possible, and to what extent the Westphalian state system would have itself sought a pragmatism and a compromise with a new kind of member. The price for peace on both sides, meaning a compromise, it would have meant all the same the continuation of the digital outreach, meaning a new kind of state with both a geopolitical and a digital presence, both co-equal. All of these things spoke to a new international relations, which we don't appreciate. And now that we have, quote unquote, defeated ISIS, we don't think about these things anymore. Maybe we should. After Al Qaeda, we were surprised by ISIS. After ISIS, what comes next? Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.